Abu Bakr Al Bahgdadi wasn't in Iraq after all, nor anywhere near the remnants of his former ISIS caliphate. U.S. helicopters flying all the way over to northwest Syria's Idlib province, near the border with Turkey, to carry out Saturday's raid against the leader of the so-called Islamic State group. This in an area that's a stronghold of jihadist rivals Al-Qaeda, in a region replete with lots of outside powers, all claiming to be fighting terrorism. What does that say? And what to make of an operation perhaps precipitated by Donald Trump's abrupt decision to pull out of northeast Syria? In life as in death, Baghdadi's public relations war will continue. So will radicals remember the Iraqi-born insurgent leader as a jihadist version of Che Guevara? Or ultimately, will they perceive him as a loser? Loser, a term dear to the current president of the United States. How will Donald Trump's handling of the operation compare with the one ordered by his predecessor, Barack Obama, against Osama bin Laden 8 years ago? Oh, how much has changed. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what comes next after Baghdadi. Joining us, France 24's Wassim Nasser. Thank you for being with us. Joining us as well, sociologist Farhad Khosrow-Kavar of the Paris School of Higher Learning and Social Studies, EHESS. Your books include Radicalization, Why Some People Choose the Path of Violence. Thanks for being with us. Jasmine El Gamal is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former Middle East Advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense. Thank you for being with us from Istanbul.
Thanks for having me.
And from Cambridge, Massachusetts, reporter Rania Abu Zaid, the author of No Turning Back, Life, Loss, and Hope in Wartime Syria. Good to see you, Rania.
Thank you. You too.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Just 5 kilometers from the Turkish border, that's where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was laying low. Wassim Cornet has more.
Is Barisha, a Syrian village just a few kilometers from the Turkish border. And this pile of rubble is what's left of the building that housed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The hunt for the IS group leader took a new turn over the summer after one of his wives and a courier were arrested. They were interrogated by U.S. intelligence, who were able to establish that al-Baghdadi was hiding somewhere in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. U.S. military was then able to identify several houses that the terrorist leader used as shelter. One of the buildings belonged to a local al-Qaeda leader. That is where U.S. Special Forces were sent. Prior to this weekend, the operation had been canceled 3 times.
Well, the stars started lining up some time ago, and in the past couple weeks, a week or so, the operational forces, which were one of several options available to the president, started rehearsing and practicing and doing what they would have to do on the objective.
On Saturday, 8 helicopters carrying Delta Force members took off from the Al-Assad base in Iraq. After an hour-long flight, they arrived in Barisha, but were quickly spotted and began sustaining heavy fire.
I opened the door and I saw a helicopter hovering around 15 meters above the ground and another one right behind it. There were no shots fired at first, and then suddenly there was gunfire and the helicopter began firing back.
Inside the house, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, along with several of his wives and children. The leader attempted to flee but ended up cornered in a tunnel. That's when he detonated his suicide vest, killing himself and 3 of his children. The IS group leader's identity was soon confirmed. His DNA had been collected by the U.S. Army when he was detained in an Iraqi prison in 2004. U.S. Special Forces spent 2 hours in the house collecting strategic data before flying back to Iraq. The building was then destroyed in an airstrike.
Wassim Nasser, I have to ask this question because how many times have we had false reports of Baghdadi's death? Are you convinced? Is he dead?
I'm convinced because the U.S. president wouldn't go this far in his claim if he wasn't sure. And this is the first time that they send troops on the ground with samples from his DNA that they got at Buka prison, and to compare the in situ comparison of the DNA. So I think that today we are like in an era where if the president is not saying the truth or if he's wrong, Baghdadi wouldn't be late before he speaks out. And if he does, if he's still alive, it will be a huge blow to President Trump. So I think that he's pretty sure, otherwise he wouldn't go this far in his claim.
Were you surprised to see this mission with these helicopters flying low all the way across northern Iraq from east to west?
Well, actually, because the base of Ain al-Assad is a base which is fit for special operations, where they can prepare such kind of operations. It's a bit surprising that they didn't go, for example, from the Incirlik base in Turkey, but for secrecy reasons, it could be understandable that they choose to do it this way. I remember when they killed the Bin Laden in Pakistan, they didn't even tell Pakistani authorities. They went in and out.
So the idea was not to tell the Turks, otherwise they would have gone from the NATO base at Incirlik.
Yes, no, the idea was to tell the less people possible. He didn't even tell the Democrats. So why would he tell the Turks? So he told the Turks at the last minute, he told the Russians at the last minute, and even factions on the ground knew at the last minute. I had some witnesses on the ground telling me that even Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is an Islamist group in Idlib, told its fighters not to shoot on helicopters, incoming helicopters, since they are Turkish and they are coming to bring some things to the Turkish observation points. So everybody was aware of this operation, but very few people aware that it was targeting Baghdadi indeed.
Rania Abu Zaid, your travels in that part of Syria, there are all kinds of radicals of all stripes. Nonetheless, are you surprised to find Baghdadi there?
Yes and no. Yes, because of the political and the personal rivalries that we've seen between the groups that are in Idlib and Islamic State. And no, because Islamic State is a lawless province. And even the jihadis in Islamic State, that they form many different splinter groups. And there are certainly sleeper cells, Islamic State sleeper cells in Idlib city. Even Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which your guest referred to, has been rounding up some sleeper cells in that area. So there are all sorts of different people in what is a lawless, ungoverned space.
A lawless, ungoverned space. And what does it tell you? The fact that, again, this U.S. operation is able to go from east to west across Syria and carry out this raid and then go all the way back.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of indicates the transnational nature of the threat that Baghdadi posed. And, to be clear, when I talk about Idlib as an ungoverned space, it's also home to millions of civilians who are trapped under those black flags and also trapped, they also don't want to be governed by an Assad regime that has spent years trying to kill them. Baghdadi was primarily a big threat to people of the region. Let's not forget that most of Islamic State's victims were, in fact, other Muslims, Arabs, and Kurds in the region. So, the primary benefactors, if you like, of his demise are the people of the region. But having said that, of course, this is a group that is lost its, it has had previous leaders, and they are all taken out in a violent manner. This is the nature of the group and the nature of the leadership. So, the next questions that we need to think about is who's going to replace him and what happens next.
Who's going to replace him? What happens next? Farid Koskovar, you've been covering radical movements for decades, and in the grand scale of things, does it just one leader replaces another, or is this an important date?
They will be competing. There will be some people competing with each other in order to become the leader. So there might be some kind of, infighting within Daesh, but it will survive. There's no problem for Daesh to disappear because of the death of Al Baghdadi. I mean, there was a good inquiry made by some social scientists in those parts, in the Kurdish region where there were thousands of people, arrested by them. And many people did not know even al-Baghdadi. They knew the Islamic State, Dawla Islamiyya, and not al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi was totally different from Bin Laden, who was a charismatic leader and who talked, a lot, and then who sent video sequences and interviews to many people for a long time. So in that respect, my guess is that his death will be a blow for a time being. So there will be a kind of fighting between different people who would like to become, the leader.
people who don't follow it closely, they get confused over the labels. I've talked about this with Wasim on many an occasion. Some people saying, okay, the difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is an important one because one wants global jihad, kind of like Trotskyites want global Marxism, and the other wants a piece of territory, an actual concrete piece of land.
A caliphate, within a specific territory. Yeah?
How's that argument going to go now that Baghdadi's dead?
It's finished. I mean, Daesh is still present in many countries. In Syria, part of Syria, but not in an organized manner. I mean, like a state. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sinai, in Egypt, in Philippines, in Western Africa, and so on. So it is present and it is very important, but it is not a unified structure. These are, kind of networks. So it resembles more and more what might be, Al-Qaeda. In that respect, one can say that up to now, at least, Daesh is dead as a state, but certainly not as a network, as a jihadist organization.
Or as an ideology. We're going to get back to that point. But again, I want to get back to this issue of the fact that, well, this happened 5 kilometers from the Turkish border. Turkey, which says it was kept abreast by the Trump administration of the operation.
Our military and intelligence units were in contact with their American counterparts and coordinated, especially on the other night when the operation was conducted. We can say that there was intense diplomacy between our military authorities.
Your reaction to those remarks, Jasmine El Gamal?
I'd like to echo what Rania said about the transnational nature of the threat and the reason why this was so well executed with so many different actors in such a small area is that the nature of the threat was actually taken really seriously by all of these different actors. So it doesn't surprise me in the least for Turkey and the U.S. to have been in contact throughout the operation and for Turkey to be kind of hand in glove with the U.S., trying to make sure that this threat was overtaken once and for all.
But you heard Wasim Nasser saying the Americans, nonetheless, preferring to put the Turks in the know at the latest moment possible. And there'll be those once again asking how serious Turkey is when it comes to chasing jihadists when you find out that, well, the leader of ISIS was only 5 kilometers from their border.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a fair point, Francois, but you also have to remember that, this is a leader. Al Baghdadi was someone who had evaded multiple countries' intelligence services for a long time. I mean, this is someone who was quite adept at disguising his movements and changing his locations and doing so in a way that was able to allow him to evade arrest for so long. So I personally don't read too much into conspiracy theories about why he was able to hide so close to the Turkish border. I would focus much more on the fact that, Turkey was working with the United States and with all of these other actors to make sure that he was eventually brought to justice.
Wasim Nasser?
Well, actually, people who worked on these issues knew that we have 2 options for Baghdadi. Either the Syrian-Iraqi border south of the Euphrates, either Idlib. For the simple reasons, because those regions aren't covered by US aviation. Knowing that they are very effective against jihadi leaders, it's only the US that killed all the jihadi leaders of the Islamic State, either in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Libya last week. So by being in a region which is covered by Russian airplanes, he knew that he had more chances on one hand, and on the other hand, that he knew that the Americans have to negotiate with the Russians in order to intervene. You add to this that he's on the border with Turkey, knowing that it is very risky for anyone to attack him without going into negotiations with Turkey. So his choice was deliberate to be in the zone. And we have to remember also that Turkey had many attacks on its soil by Islamic State leaders, Islamic State jihadis, and Turkey fought the jihadis at many points, and even 2 Turkish soldiers were burned in a cage by the Islamic State. Because for them, for the Islamic State, the Turkish army and Erdogan are apostates to be fought. they use Turkey as a logistical background, but as any organization would use any country with underground means. So I totally agree. We shouldn't overread in this situation that the fact that he was next to the Turkish
He was so
border.
so close to the border. I want to talk, Rania Abu Zaid, I know you have to leave us for part 2, so I want to just talk for a minute about the context where you are. There was this separate weekend raid where the U.S. once again going outside of its influence, its zone of influence. The Daily Beast quoting Pentagon sources as confirming the CIA targeted and killed an ISIS spokesperson, Abu al-Hassan al-Muhajir, his name. And this happened in Aleppo province near Jarablus with the help of the Kurdish-led SDF forces. Donald Trump, speaking a short while ago to an association of Chicago police officers, commented on Baghdadi's death. And, well, he turned his remarks against the Democrats.
He's dead. He's dead as a doornail. And he didn't die bravely either, I will tell you that. He should have been killed years ago. Another president should have gotten him. But to me, it was a very important, I would say all the time, they'd walk into my office.
Rania, how are those kinds of remarks going down where you are?
It's just vintage Trump, isn't it? He can turn any circumstance, any event into an attack against his domestic allies. So it's just, more of the same from a president who is very adept at making any issue about him and his local.
People are just kind of grown used to it.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, he was also booed yesterday at a sports stadium. Publicly booed. So I mean, they are used to it, but it doesn't mean that they particularly like it.
Doesn't mean they particularly like it. And again, your thoughts on how important a moment this is.
It's certainly significant that Islamic State has lost its leader and its spokesman in the span of like 24 hours, coming after its loss of territory. However, let's not forget that this is, at its core, an insurgent terrorist group. It has sleeper cells. It had sleeper cells in Idlib. It has sleeper cells in Iraq that have made their presence felt in recent months. Let's not forget that with the hasty U.S. withdrawal and the Turkish-backed, the incursion of the Turkish-backed Syrian forces into northeastern Syria, there were escapes, prison breakouts from these camps that were housing Islamic State detainees, sympathizers, affiliates, and other people who just happened to be living in that area. Some of those people, the fighters at least, will certainly regroup, will probably join some of these sleeper cells. And, there is bound to be a sense of revenge as well among Islamic State supporters and fighters. This may actually reinvigorate a group which is down, but certainly not out.
All right. I want to thank you, Rania Abu Zaid. We'll be back with the rest of our panel after a quick break. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at what changes after the targeting and killing of Abu Bakr Al Bahgdadi by U.S. Special Forces. We're in the company of France 24's Wasim Nasser, sociologist Farhad Khosrow-Kavar of the Paris School of Higher Learning and Social Studies. Your books include Radicalization, Why Some People Choose the Path of Violence, and Jasmine El-Gamal, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a former Middle East advisor to the U.S. Defense Department, who joins us from Istanbul. We were talking about it just before the break. The public relations of the current U.S. administration, very different from that of Donald Trump's predecessor. Roll back the clock to 2011 and that White House press handout of the photo of Barack Obama's inner cabinet watching live the raid against Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad near Pakistan's capital. And compare, if you will, with the one showing Trump with Vice President Mike Pence, his national security advisor, the defense secretary, and the joint chiefs of staff, looking at the raid that took place over the weekend. Farhad, I know you're a sociologist. You're not a semiotician, but what do you make of the contrast when you see those two photos?
My guess is that, Trump is a populist. You know, he is a kind of person who lies every day, many times, and whatever he says is wrong. I mean, in the fact that he says, for instance, that he died like a dog, or he died, you know, as a coward. It's nonsense. It's not true. He triggered, you know, his suicide vest, and then he died. And in a way, you know, I'm sure that of course, he was a criminal. He was a kind of person, you know, who should have died or should have been, you know, condemned to life prison.
If you're a radical jihadist, does it matter if the president of the United States is Barack Obama or Donald Trump? Or is it all the same?
It might have, I mean, a meaning because, at least in that respect, up to now, they have been supposed to be brave towards death. I mean, not accept, you know, to be vilified or to be humiliated in terms of dying. So, because they kill and they get, I mean, and they die in a manner that cannot be qualified as being coward. So, I think it's totally wrong what he says. It's totally wrong. It's against the facts, you know.
Well, true. When someone triggers his explosive vest, you cannot say that he died in a coward way, because if you look at it from the jihadi point of view, from their public, he did exactly what he should have done.
Exactly.
Dying with his arms in his hand, igniting his explosive vest, and without surrendering.
According to the U.S., though, he killed 3 children alongside him.
Yes, but this is because he didn't want the infidels to get his children. You can always find justification to what happened in this kind of context. So for them, for their literature, for their propaganda, they preferred for their leaders to die this way, and not to die in their beds, as they say, as most of Arab leaders, for example. And just one more thing, you asked a question about the comparison between Obama and Trump. For Obama, he was the president that conducted the highest number of drone attacks. So for the jihadis, it's maybe the same. But one more special thing about Trump, I was talking once to a communicator of Al-Qaeda when Donald Trump was designated by the Republican Party. He wasn't even elected yet. And he told me, it's very good. It's a sign of God. He will hasten the last fight, and I'm gonna be able to rest now. And I said, why? Rest from what? He said, we're not gonna produce propaganda anymore. We're just gonna translate his speeches.
Jasmine Al-Kamal, your thoughts on the way the story's been told from the White House the last 48 hours?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Francois, because I think we have to keep in mind that President Trump is always talking to 2 audiences at the same time. I mean, to a certain extent, every U.S. president does, but in particular, when it comes to President Trump, his domestic audience is often even more important than his international audience, because he wants to prove that he is a president who is fulfilling every single one of his campaign promises. He's a man of his word, and he makes deals and he gets things done. That is essential and an integral part of his re-election campaign. And so for him to be able to so when he was talking about the death of Baghdadi, he was talking to 2 audiences. One is his domestic audience. It was full of bravado. It was full of bragging in a way, because that's his persona in front of his base. But the other audience that he was talking to, I believe, was anybody who was thinking or who would be thinking about joining an organization like ISIS in the future. And I think that's why he was so meticulous and detailed in his description of Baghdadi's death and tried to portray it in the most humiliating of ways. Because if you look at, in terms of Arab culture, like Latin American culture, a number of other cultures place a great deal of importance on bravado and machismo and sort of the role of a man and the bravery of a man. So for Donald Trump to say that he was whimpering and screaming and crying and taking kids into the tunnel with him, yes, of course, at the end of the day, he did detonate the suicide vest, and so he will be considered a martyr probably in the eyes of his supporters. But the language that Trump used was so humiliating that it was very much designed for an audience of potential recruits for this organization.
So the language does matter.
Absolutely. Language always matters.
Farhad Khosrower, you agree?
Yeah, of course. But at the same time, he's so discredited among the Democrats all over the world, so that whatever he says, is taken as a kind of fake news for many people. And in that respect, it is a fake news, because he didn't die the way he described it. He died, most probably in his own eyes and in the eyes of his followers as a kind of martyr in the way of jihad. And so this description, discredits the president in the eyes of the world. Of course, not his followers. I mean, some of the GOP, as it's called, would find it beautiful what he says. But most of the people, even many Americans, do not follow him in that respect, so far as I can see.
All right, then there's the other aspect of it is the talk about this being precipitated by the fact that Donald Trump had announced a few weeks back that sudden and abrupt withdrawal from northeast Syria and its backing from the Kurds. Since then, there's been some backpedaling of sorts, with now word that the U.S. is partially going to stay in the area, although not all the way up to the border where the Turks and the forces they support have moved in. Donald Trump's Syria withdrawal still confusing. Is the United States staying or going? Here he is talking. Earlier to reporters.
Russia treated us great. They opened up. We had to fly over certain Russia areas, Russia-held areas. Russia was great. Iraq was excellent. We really had great cooperation. And you have to understand, they didn't know what we were doing and where we were going exactly. But the ISIS fighters are hated as much by Russia and some of these other countries as they are by us. And that's why I say they should start doing a lot of the fighting now, and they'll be able to. I really believe they'll be able to. Yes, Jennifer?
Can you say what role the Kurds played in this, just generally?
They gave us not a military role at all, but they gave us some information that turned out to be helpful, the Kurds.
And can you tell us what the role of Turkey might have been in Iraq?
Who?
What was the role of Turkey? How did they help?
Turkey, we dealt with them. They know we were going in. We flew over some territory. They were terrific, no problem. They were not problem. They could start shooting, and then we will take them out, but a lot of bad things can happen. Plus, it was a very secret mission. We flew very, very low and very, very fast.
Was he, so I don't quite understand, Jasmine Al-Gamal, was he praising Turkey or threatening them towards the end of that answer?
He was praising them. I mean, one thing that the president has been trying to do for a long time now in Syria is try to get everyone else to chip in and share the burden. And a lot of his rhetoric towards Turkey specifically over the last few weeks, especially in the run-up to their incursion into Syria, was a bit of, good cop, bad cop, and wanting to let them know that he was extremely serious about his mission and what he wants to do in terms of getting U.S. troops out of Syria, but that he was equally adamant that they share, their part of, or carry their share of the burden. And so I think that in this particular operation, again, like I said before, you saw all of these different actors who at various points throughout the conflict have been at odds with each other and sometimes even working directly against each other's interests. But for this particular operation, because of the transnational and common nature, collective nature of the threat posed by al-Baghdadi, this was a moment when we really saw everyone come together and play their part. And this is the kind of cooperation and burden sharing that the president has been trying to achieve writ large when it comes to Syria. And, I hope we can talk for a few minutes at some point about, what comes next in terms of not just from the counterterrorism perspective of this, but more from a longer term, more sustainable solution when it comes to the enduring defeat of ISIS, as the president says.
Yeah, because there's a lot of bits that are still confusing. Wasim Nasser, we mentioned in part one of our discussion how the same weekend there was a raid to take out an ISIS spokesperson in Aleppo province. That one was in cooperation with the Kurdish-led SDF. So,
yeah,
are they abandoning the Kurds or not?
No, they are. Trump was very clear. he doesn't want to be a buffer between the Kurds and the Turks. So as long as the Kurds accepted to retreat and the Turks have what they want from Russia and from the US, he said he is willing to protect the oil fields in eastern Syria and continue the fight against ISIS. And the Kurds gave information because the Kurds had information regarding smuggling of people from eastern Syria all the way to Idlib. And they had this kind of information. So the person that was targeted, the spokesperson, which isn't confirmed by the Americans yet, he was targeted when he was hiding in a truck. And he was traveling from Manbij, so Kurdish-held areas, to Turkish-held areas. And this is how they got him. Because I guess he got afraid after Baghdadi's death, and so he moved. And in intelligence services, they when they make a hit like this, they see what's moving, because they know that people that move are important people. So this way they got him. But there's a small contradiction, a big contradiction, by guarding the oil, because the oil, we know that the Kurds are using it, but they are sending part of it to Assad through intermediaries who are on the US watch list. So there's a lot of contradictions, and we saw that more troops entered Syria in the last days than those who left Syria a week ago. So things are still unfolding, I guess, but Trump is trying to hold on to the Kurds as an ally against jihadi groups.
Mm-hmm. What's going on? Is there like a big stalemate, or are the pieces of the puzzle moving in Syria?
My guess, I mean, I'm not well aware of what's going on, on the ground, because it's very complicated. But my guess is it's a kind of inconsequential, policy of Trump's, because Russia has become much stronger in the region. In a way, Turkey has become part of the new game, and America is mostly absent. So that, in a way...
Mostly absent, except when it comes to taking out jihadists. They seem to be the only ones who take out high-profile jihadists. Am I wrong?
No, but at the same time, I would say it's something which happens, at some time, and then it's finished. So from time to time, he will bomb them, he will kill them, but
then what?
Politically speaking,
there's no political outcome out of this. Okay, it's
but
war
I'd
against
like to
terrorism,
jump
but
in
there's
for
no
a
political political outcome for the US by conducting this war. On the same time, Russians have a plan, Iranians have a plan, Turks have a plan that they are unfolding on the ground.
Jasmine El-Gamal?
Yeah, sorry, because I just wanted to jump in here because I think there's a really important thread that we're neglecting to bring out as part of this discussion. I actually have always said that President Trump's Syria policy, it's always been clear in the sense that he's always had two strategic goals in Syria. One was defeating ISIS, and the other one that we haven't mentioned yet, which is really important, is countering Iranian influence. And so if you add that aspect, the countering Iranian influence, into it, it starts to make a lot more sense. The president's policy on Syria has always been clear. My only problem with it has been the way that he's conducted his policy. We've always known that he wanted to leave Syria. It's just the way that he does it is so it's knee-jerk reactions and not consulting with our allies and not telling our partners ahead of time, leaving them very confused. But in the sense of what he wants to achieve, and that just brings me to the point that I wanted to add to this last discussion, is that if you look at the residual troops that he's keeping in Syria, it's not just about the oil. It's not just about countering ISIS. It's very much about keeping sort of one American foot in the door, just enough to let the Iranians know that they can't wreak havoc and do whatever they want in Syria, including building a land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's a really important point that I think we need not forget.
Well, why pull back? Why have that abrupt pullback from the Turkish border then?
Because it doesn't interest him.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't interest him. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, he and remember that this is a president who's constantly at odds with his advisors. I think if a lot of his advisors, these career officials, were in charge, the policy and the way that it's being conducted would look very different. But, when it comes to who owns Syria, quote unquote, who has the most influence inside of Syria, President Trump wants nothing to do with that. He's more than happy to have the Turks deal with the Kurds on their own, to have the Russians mediate and have influence over Assad. He really doesn't care. What he cares about is minimizing Iranian influence and their link to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to making sure that ISIS doesn't grow into the threat that it was before. And that just brings me to the final point that I wanted to make, which is that Baghdadi's death is really important, especially for people who have been victimized by Daesh. I've had a friend whose wife lost a brother and a husband, and so this is really important to people like her. But this is one man, and whether or not the organization structurally suffers, I think it's really important to keep in mind that all of the root causes, the grievances that allowed the organization to feed on so many people's grievances and recruit so many people are still there. And that's something that won't be dealt with from a counterterrorism lens or perspective.
That's an important point, because we've spent most of the hour talking about military and counterinsurgency tactics. But how do you counter an ideology? And in the case of Baghdadi's death, the reasons to people want to join radical groups, how do you make those go away?
Actually, we have to realize that the objective reasons that made the Islamic State grow are aggravated today. Today we have millions of people in camps, cities completely destroyed, starting with the border with Iran up to the border with Lebanon, and people without any perspective, with men in prison or dead, and children today at the age of 10 or 11 in 2-3 years, when the military pressure will go down, they take up arms in the name of the Islamic State or in another organization. That's the way it is today. If you don't respond to the grievances of this population, it will be a never-ending war, because jihadi groups capitalize on real grievances, plus the ideology is the crossing between those two that leads to jihadi violent movements.
Right now,
Absolutely.
we're seeing in Iraq, people are fed up with the system as it is now, with mismanagement, corruption. What do you?
I mean, in many parts of the Arab world nowadays, we have this sort of protest movement, but which is not translated into any kind of jihadist or Islamist, ideology, because there is
the violence right now is on the government side.
On the government side, at the same time, people are growing aware of the fact that jihadism is not the solution either, because jihadism means violence, means killing, maiming, and so on, and for almost 3 decades they have done it without any kind of tangible result. There are minorities who join jihadist groups, but many, are in a state of, I would say, indignation, feeling that they should do something, that they should protest. And nowadays, you have it in Iraq, you have it in many parts of the Arab world, you have it in Algeria, you have it, in part of Libya, So it is not a jihadist movement. It is a movement of citizens who are fed up with government corruption and the mismanagement of the economy. And of course, the way the West is dealing with these problems too is problematic. For instance, what they did, after overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya, Europeans did not act, in a consequent manner, in a rational manner. So it is a kind of movement nowadays. Some people talk about the second revolution in the Arab world, but it is not sufficiently organized. So that it is a protest movement. For instance, more than 100 have been killed in Iraq. And nowadays, almost every day you have a few dozen of people who are killed by the army. And nowadays, as you know, that there is a kind of the army is becoming very, very much involved in Iraq in killing and maiming people who are protesting. So this has nothing to do with jihadism. But it might be translated into a jihadist movement if part of those people find a kind of organization. The ideology is there, but the ideology is not very much attractive to many people because of the past, because of those 30, 40 years during which, jihadism has done nothing constructively, has destroyed everything. But still, there is a minority who might follow
still be tempted by it.
And can be very dangerous.
Farad Khosrow-Kalbar, I want to thank you. I want to thank Wasim Nasser. I want to thank Jasmine El Gamal for being with us from Istanbul. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, been taking a look at reactions to this online. Donald Trump undoubtedly has been stung by the criticism of what he chose to do in Syria, withdrawing the US troops. This was his chance to bathe in the glory of a successful mission. But historically, he doesn't actually approve of grandstanding. A lot of people drawing attention to this tweet from back in 2012, where he said, "Stop congratulating Obama for killing bin Laden. The Navy SEALs killed bin Laden." So perhaps a little bit of hypocrisy there that a lot of people are pointing towards. It's not the only way in which there have been comparisons drawn with what happened back in 2011. This was the photograph from the Situation Room that was released by the White House. Everyone looking very pensive. Interestingly, there are some disconnected cables, which a lot of people are very puzzled by. Some wondering why this photo perhaps wasn't a little better stage managed. Others wondering, was it staged completely? Because it does look to be a little posed. It's supposed to be taken during the raid itself, but you'll notice that the eyes are looking in different directions. So not sure if they were looking at multiple screens, but anyway, lots of people feeling that this wasn't perhaps the most successful photograph. Breitbart, though, liked it, unsurprisingly, you might say. They slightly toned down their headline earlier on in the day. They're still calling it an iconic photo, but earlier on in the day they had iconic photo, Trump game face epic was their headline.
Right.
Yes, indeed. Stark contrast, obviously, with what we know to be such a recognisable photograph. Everyone knows what this photograph is, what it pertains to, the shot of Hillary Clinton with her hand over her mouth as the raid on Osama bin Laden, the successful raid that led to his death, was taking place. That was back in May 2011. This was put on Instagram by Pete Souza, who was the White House photographer back then, now very much almost a professional Trump critic, frankly. He points out that he had a great deal of access to the Situation Room. He said he took 1,000 photographs that day. And again, very much in contrast to that one image that we've seen so far coming out of the White House. It's interesting as well that it's not just photographs getting a lot of attention, it's language too. Donald Trump's phrase, "he died like a dog," made it onto the front page of the New York Post. And the Daily Beast is reporting that really Donald Trump's version of events was very much turning it into a reality television show, talking about he died like a coward, he died whimpering, screaming and crying. And really it says he was trying to destroy one myth, that of a heroic martyr, by building up another myth, that of the US operation. But the language that everyone really is talking about right now comes from the Washington Post. This was their third attempt at a headline for the obituary. And this was the second one. Where they downgraded him to just an austere religious scholar, which a lot of people thought was very strange. We've seen a lot of people taking the mickey out of the Washington Post today. Yes, quite why they felt the need to change it, I don't know. But what they have said is that it should never have read that way, and they did change it quickly.
All right, Emma James, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.